The sun was setting over the quiet city streets when a police cruiser pulled up behind a sleek black sedan. Inside, a black woman in her early 30s adjusted her rear-view mirror. She'd been driving home from a long day at work, barely noticing the flashing lights behind her. But when she heard the officer's voice over the intercom, she knew. She could feel it. He wasn't just pulling her over for a simple traffic stop. The way he spoke, the tone. It was a judgment before he even knew her name. "You know why I stopped you?" he asked, stepping out of the car, his gaze piercing through her rear view. He didn't wait for an answer. She didn't flinch. But what he didn't know was that she wasn't just another black woman on the road. And today, she wasn't going to let his assumptions slide. He thought she was just a regular person. Another woman of color who'd have no power, no voice. But in that moment, she was about to show him exactly who she was. Not just any woman, but the very woman responsible for holding people like him accountable. What happens next is a lesson in power, privilege, and the kind of justice that never comes easy. Before we jump into today's story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. If you love powerful stories of justice, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share so you never miss what's coming next. Now, let's get started. Her name was Layla, but to the people in power, she was a shadow, a figure they never saw coming. Layla had worked hard to climb the ranks of the police force, but she knew better than anyone that being black in a world built on privilege was a daily fight. Most people didn't know her story. They only saw the uniform, the badge, the silent determination in her eyes. But she wasn't just a cop. She was the head of internal affairs, the very department responsible for investigating corruption, brutality, and misconduct within the force. A position that made her both respected and feared, yet somehow still invisible to those who didn't believe someone like her could wield that kind of power. Layla's rise hadn't been easy. She had faced more than her fair share of doubt, prejudice, and outright hostility from colleagues who thought she didn't belong in a position of authority. But with every challenge she grew stronger, more resolute. She had made it to the top, not because of favoritism but because she had earned it, through grit, intelligence, and an unwavering commitment to justice. As the officer's cruiser closed in behind her, she didn't hesitate to glance at her rearview mirror, knowing exactly what was coming. Another day, another test. She took a deep breath, gripping the steering wheel with a calm, almost practiced ease. Little did he know, this was about to be the most important stop of his career. The officer's footsteps were heavy on the asphalt as he approached her car. Layla kept her hands visible, resting on the wheel, her posture straight, unwavering. He reached the window, his uniform crisp, his stance already full of authority. "License and registration," he demanded, his voice clipped, as though he had already decided she was guilty of something. Anything. She complied, moving slowly to avoid giving him any reason to escalate the situation. She could feel his eyes on her, scanning her with a quiet judgment. She wasn't surprised. She'd been stopped countless times before. Always because of the color of her skin, never because of anything she had actually done. This wasn't a random traffic stop. This was routine for her, routine for him. "Ma'am, do you know how fast you were going?" he asked, his tone dripping with condescension. Layla didn't respond immediately. Instead, she met his gaze through the side mirror. She could see it in his eyes. The suspicion. The assumptions that came with being black in a country where the badge often meant more than the person behind it. She wasn't just a driver to him. She wasn't just a civilian. She was someone to be controlled, to be intimidated. A suspect before she even spoke a word. "You don't look like you belong here," he added, his eyes narrowing as if to make sure his words landed. She felt the familiar sting of injustice. It wasn't just this officer. It was the system that had put him in a position where this kind of behavior was allowed, encouraged even. She could already feel the weight of it pressing in, the old, painful reality of being doubted, being dismissed. But what he didn't know was that she wasn't just anyone. She wasn't someone to back down, not when the stakes were this high. And as she handed him her ID and registration, she couldn't help but wonder, what if this time he wasn't going to walk away with just a warning? What if this time she wasn't going to be the one left powerless? Layla watched as the officer took her documents, his back turned to her as he walked back to his cruiser. The soft click of his radio echoed in the silence, and she felt the moment stretch out, the tension thickening the air around her. For a brief moment, she considered letting the encounter unfold as it always did. Another officer's assumption, another wasted minute. But something in her shifted. The power dynamic wasn't as simple as he thought. She wasn't just an average driver, an easy target for bias. She wasn't some faceless woman he could belittle. He had no idea that the very system he worked for, the same badge he wore, was the system she had dedicated her life to fixing. The world didn't see it, but Layla had a role that no one expected, one that could turn his entire perception upside down. As he returned to her car, a cocky grin on his face, Layla's mind raced. He had no idea that every move he made, every unjust comment was recorded and documented. No idea that his actions, and those of officers like him, were being watched by her. She was more than just a cop in a uniform. She was the head of internal affairs, the department responsible for investigating her own. Every officer, every misconduct, every time a badge was misused. Her very existence was a threat to everything he stood for. She was the one who held the power to expose what was wrong in the system, to make sure that those who used their badge for injustice were held accountable. He had no idea how close he was to meeting his reckoning. As the officer leaned in her window again, Layla's heart didn't race. Instead, a calm resolution filled her chest. He thought he was in control, but in this moment, the truth was about to shatter his world. The officer handed back her documents, his grin still lingering. But before he could speak, Layla's voice cut through the tension. "You've been pulling over a lot of black drivers tonight, haven't you?" she asked, her tone steady but laced with a quiet authority. The officer froze. For a split second, his eyes flickered with surprise, then he quickly masked it with a shrug. "It's part of the job, ma'am. Just routine checks." Layla could see through the lie. She could sense the mounting unease in him as he tried to brush her off, but she wasn't about to let this slip by. There was something off about this encounter, something more than just a routine stop. "I think we both know this isn't routine," she continued, her eyes narrowing, "and I think you know exactly what I'm talking about." His hand tightened around her documents, his knuckles whitening as he struggled to keep his composure. But Layla didn't back down. She leaned slightly forward, her gaze unwavering. This wasn't about just getting through a traffic stop. This was bigger. She was testing the waters, pushing, waiting for the slightest crack in his facade. The officer stepped back, a sharp breath escaping him. His hand hesitated above his radio. He knew better than to escalate things, but Layla's words were cutting deeper than he'd anticipated. A cold realization was creeping in. She wasn't the kind of woman he could intimidate. She wasn't afraid to use her position, her authority, and her knowledge of the system to confront the very things he represented. She knew how much power she held, and she was ready to use it. With a flick of his wrist, he signaled for backup. But even as he did, he knew he had just made a dangerous mistake, because as soon as the backup arrived, it wouldn't just be him Layla was facing. It would be the whole system. The tension in the air thickened, as if the entire city was holding its breath. Layla was no longer just the woman he had pulled over. She was a force, and he had no idea how deep that force ran. The screech of tires interrupted the quiet hum of the evening, and within moments another squad car rolled up behind the officer's cruiser. Layla didn't flinch. She already knew what was coming, but what the officer didn't know was that the tide had already started to turn. The backup officer, a tall, imposing man, stepped out, his hand resting on his holstered gun. He sized Layla up with a glance, then turned to his colleague, the original officer. "Everything good here?" he asked, his voice cool, but there was a hint of confusion in his eyes. The officer in front of Layla hesitated, then nodded. Just a routine stop. Layla couldn't hold back any longer. She leaned out of her window, her voice clear, cutting through the air like a blade. Not quite. Actually, I think you should know exactly who you're dealing with. For a heartbeat, the officer stood still, confused. Layla's calm demeanor was unsettling, and neither of them could figure out where this was going. And then she said it. I'm the head of internal affairs, and everything you just did, the profiling, the assumptions, the attitude, it's all being documented. Right now, as we speak, your actions are being logged. Every word you've said to me, every decision you've made, it's all going to be reviewed. By me. The backup officer's face drained of color, his hand instinctively hovering closer to his weapon. The original officer's expression shifted from irritation to disbelief. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. The world around them seemed to pause as Layla's words settled in the air. Layla wasn't just any officer. She wasn't just a woman of color in a sea of faces that didn't look like hers. She was the one who would expose the corruption, the injustice, and the abuse of power within the very institution they worked for. And now, they were on the wrong side of that truth. The backup officer's gaze darted to his colleague, then back to Layla. This is a mistake. Layla's lips parted slightly, the weight of her words hanging in the air. The mistake was made when you assumed you could treat me like anyone else. I'm the one who makes sure people like you are held accountable. A stunned silence hung between them. The officers had underestimated her, believed that she was just another woman they could dismiss, another black person they could write off. But now, they saw the power she held, the quiet strength that came from being the one who saw through the system they took for granted. But that wasn't the most shocking part. The real twist was just beginning. The silence between them stretched longer, thick with the realization of what Layla had just revealed. The backup officer stepped back, his hand still hovering near his gun, uncertain whether to challenge her or step away. The original officer, now pale and visibly rattled, stammered for words, but nothing came out. Layla's calm confidence was a stark contrast to the fear beginning to set in around them. She didn't wait for them to find their footing. She didn't need to. I'm going to give you both one chance, she said, her voice steady and unwavering. I could write you up, launch an investigation, and make sure this is the last time either of you get behind the wheel without someone watching over you, but I won't. Not today. The backup officer met her gaze, his shoulders slumping in defeat, as though the weight of his own actions had suddenly caught up with him. The original officer, on the other hand, looked as though he wanted to argue, but one look at Layla told him there was no room for defiance. She had already won. The truth had been laid bare, and there was no way to deny it. I want you both to remember this moment, Layla continued. Remember that the system isn't as bulletproof as you think. It's full of cracks, and people like me are here to expose them. Without another word, she started the engine and drove off, leaving the two officers standing there, staring after her. It wasn't a dramatic confrontation that ended with them being dragged away in handcuffs, but the message had been clear. Layla was the change they never saw coming. She was the reckoning that was long overdue. As she drove away, Layla felt a wave of calm wash over her. She had stood her ground, and in doing so, she had not only protected herself but shown them that power was not just about badges and uniforms. It was about knowing who you were and what you stood for. The moral of this story isn't just about fighting back. It's about never underestimating the quiet strength that lies within someone who has been overlooked, dismissed, or doubted. The world may try to write you off, but sometimes the most powerful force is the one that rises from within. Never forget that your voice matters, your truth matters, and your power, when used for justice, can change everything. Thank you for watching. Maya's story reminds us that standing up for what's right can create lasting change. Whether it's overcoming adversity or challenging injustice, your voice matters. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment with your thoughts on the story. Let's keep this conversation going. And remember, sharing these stories helps spread the message of justice and fairness. One act of courage at a time. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it today.